All right. Thanks, guys, for joining us tonight. It's obviously September 1st, big month. I know it's Bourbon Heritage Month. Um, that may not be all we talk about, but tonight we got Alan Bishop. He's from Spirits of French Lick. He has come really far in the past few years, and he's full of knowledge. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to him. If you can, if you want to, when it comes to questions or whatever, you can drop them in the chat. Or, if Alan wants you to interrupt him, he'll let you know. So, Alan, it's all yours. Thanks for joining us tonight, man.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And what I'll do is I will let you decide whether or not those questions are worth interrupting for. So if there's one that you see pop up that like needs to be addressed, then feel free to jump in and ask me, because it doesn't bother me at all. So, oh, that was weird because it went to full screen with my face on it. And
It's called the spotlight.
Right. So my name is Alan Bishop. I'm the head alchemist at Spirits of French Lick, and I use alchemist instead of master distiller because, am I allowed to cuss on the show? Is that a thing? Is that okay?
Yes,
okay.
Yeah.
Just making sure. I'll try to keep it at a minimum, but I do tend to curse quite a bit. So, but I go with head alchemist instead of master distiller because I've always made the joke that if you're going to be pretentious, just be completely pretentious and be a complete asshole about it. So, there's a lot of people who are master distillers who've done nothing to earn that title whatsoever. And it's kind of a made up marketing term. So I go with alchemist because I think it's funny, right? And then people question it. So my background is in home distilling, moonshining, read that however you'd like to, but I grew up in a family of moonshiners. They were all originally from Eastern Kentucky, ended up in Pekin, Indiana in the 1940s, bought a farm here, and we raised tobacco and we made moonshine, and we basically did that to pay property taxes and pay for Christmas. All of them were factory workers, and a little extra money goes a long ways. But there's something kind of funny about paying your property taxes with whiskey money that you didn't pay taxes on in some way, shape, or form. So I remember being around stills when I was 2 or 3 years old. At that time, for me, there wasn't anything romantic about it. It was another piece of farm equipment, just like having a tractor or anything else, right? It was, if anything, it was kind of one of those things that I looked at as a kid. It's like, oh, well, that's another one of those reasons why we can't go do anything fun on the weekend, because we're going to be doing this on the weekend. My family was mostly into making sugar shine, which is the most basic thing you can do. It's literally basically 1 pound of grain per gallon, 1 pound of sugar per gallon, and they kept it real simple. We did a lot of brandies, mostly because here in Southern Indiana, everybody had an apple tree or a pear tree or peach tree. And if people used them whatsoever out of their yard, they'd make a pie out of them, maybe a little jam or whatever. And then it was, well, we'll just give them to the bishops because they'll come pick them up, and then we don't have to mow over them. So I spent a lot of time being stung by various types of bees that were attracted to fruit, for whatever that's worth. I think my dad called it a character building exercise, basically, is what it boiled down to. When I was about 15, I got tangentially interested in distilling for obvious reasons. So I either had the best parents in the world or the worst parents in the world, depending on how you want to look at it. I think they did a pretty good job overall. But they were willing to let me do stuff because they knew that I was going to find stuff. Being in rural Indiana, you're going to find stuff, right? So they were willing to let me experiment with alcohol to some degree, as long as it was done at the house. I also think there was some free labor stuff going on there, where it was check with your friends' parents, and if they're cool, then your friends come over, you guys can have a couple beers, but tomorrow morning you're going to be cutting tobacco or wood or something, right? You can have as many of your friends over as you want, as long as we get free labor out of them. So the rules that they gave me were literally the following. So Dad and Grandpa built this little 10-gallon still out of a stainless steel coffee dispenser. It was an antique dispenser from Fort Knox. It was 10 gallons. It had a thump barrel on it. And the thump barrel was made out of a stock pot that you literally would put so much luting or bread dough on that it looked like you're baking a cake. It almost took like 5 pounds of flour every time you ran the damn thing. It was ridiculous. I have pictures of it somewhere. But the rules were, don't blow your ass up in the backyard, and bring us something when it's worth drinking. And so that got me kind of tangentially interested in distilling. And then when I got a little older, got into my early 20s, I kind of converted the old tobacco farm into an organic produce farm. And I spent years really working on breeding plant varieties for organic farming. Was really kind of the thing that was mostly interested in, because there wasn't a whole lot of plant varieties that were adapted to the Ohio Valley and that style of organic agriculture. Unfortunately, there also isn't much money in that when everybody around you grows a garden and your main source of income is the farmer's market. And here comes neighbor Joe with a trunk full of tomatoes he's just giving to people. So that got me kind of thinking, distilling is inherently agricultural. And I think that got lost in this country a long time ago, unfortunately, because of industrialization. So if you're growing these odd things, and for example, you're growing a corn that might have 150 different parents. Every time corn left Oaxaca, Mexico, and it went somewhere else and got adapted, maybe you found as many of those different ones as you could, and you sort of genetically folded them back into some of the old Southern dent corns to make something different. But you can't sell it to anybody because it's odd colored or whatever. And people at that time weren't really, the heirloom movement hadn't made it to rural Indiana at that time. So you start going, well, I wonder what the whiskey would taste like if you made whiskey out of that. And that got me really interested in going deeper into the rabbit hole with distilling in particular, to the extent that by the time I was 27 or 28, I had a 150 gallon pot still. It was made out of a stainless steel milk aerator in the backyard. Probably not the smartest decision I've ever made in my life, but it happened. And that was around the same time the show Moonshiners was getting popular. So we had this unique thing happen where we would go to a party and people had my jars, and they were people that should not have known that it was coming from me. And they would come up to me and they'd talk to me and they would know that that's where the moonshine came from. And so my now wife, then girlfriend, fiance, Kim, was eventually like, listen, you're going to go get a job doing this or I'm out, one way or the other. Right. She was doing it for my own best interest. But at the time, Indiana didn't really have any craft artisan distilleries. We suffered from prohibition in major ways that people don't realize still yet today. But we didn't really get the craft distilling thing past 2014. So I basically wrote up a resume. It was the worst resume that anyone's ever written in the entire history of the world, and went to every craft distillery that was planning to open in Louisville, Kentucky, and dropped off this resume until eventually Copper and Kings hired me. And I'm pretty sure they didn't hire me because they thought I was the best person for the job, but I was likely the cheapest person for the job. Got on at Copper and Kings. I was there for 2 years. My main things there were the absinthe projects, the apple brandy, and then the Butchertown brandy. But I knew that I wanted to get back on my side of the river, what I call the right side of the river, because I knew there was a long history of distilling in Southern Indiana, particularly this little 6-county region that we call the Black Forest of Southern Indiana, which is made up of Washington, Orange, Lawrence, Harrison, Crawford, and Perry County. And I knew I could play off of that. And there was a story to be told there that had never been told historically about this one little distilling region where between 1858 and 1914, there were over 155 legal operating distilleries in the 6-county region, primarily making apple brandy, and making apple brandy of such a caliber and such quality. It was considered higher quality than actually what was being made in Normandy with Calvados at the time, to the extent that we actually exported apple brandy from that 6-county region into Normandy. So I'd made a lot of friends early on, like Steve Beam and Lisa Wicker. They're the ones that really encouraged me to get into the legal industry aside from Kim. And they also knew the owners of the French Lick Winery, which has been around since 1995. It's family owned by the Doty family. They were starting up a distillery. Now the new craft license, the artisan license, was opening up in Indiana, and they needed a distiller. And so I think I was so ready to get out of Copper and Kings at that point. I think I was actually picking grapes down in kind of eastern Kentucky, and I was in the box truck on the way home, and I answered the phone, and the owner was on the phone, and he asked me if it was something I was interested in talking to him about. And I'm pretty sure I agreed to the job before I knew before I even knew what I was getting paid, because I wanted out of there so bad, and wanted to get over, like I said, onto my, what I call the right side of the river. So that started me off at Spirits of French Lick, which is our ethos is respect the grain, the idea that grain has terroir just like grapes have terroir. And so, we approach distilling a little bit differently. So for a Kentucky distiller, they're going to tell you 60 or 70% of their flavor profile is going to come from their barrel. For us, we tend to take this more Black Forest method, which came literally because most of the settlers that were in that 6-county region were either originally from the Black Forest of Germany, or they had ancestry from that region. So we tend to approach it more like brandy distillers. And what we want is a blend and a balance, a 50-50 blend and balance. So 50% raw material, fermentation and distillation, and then 50% maturation. So that way, no matter how old any of our whiskeys ever get, there should still be positive attributes of the grain that come across. Because one of the things that happens with Kentucky distilling, and I love what the big guys do. I absolutely do. I'm not knocking them in any way, shape, or form. My dog's barking. You'll have to ignore that. Sorry. Anyways, if you get an older expression of Weller, for example, if you blinded a lot of people on those older expressions of Weller, they'd have a hard time telling you that was a wheated bourbon, because it's been overrun by the barrel in a lot of ways. And I like that barrel flavor too. But if you're going to say that you're using a mash bill that's differentiated and has a different type of grain in it, you should still be able to taste those positive attributes of that grain. There should still be something there that's interesting, unique, and textural from those grains that you use. And so that very much so is why we're into that kind of blend and balance idea. And that's why we're all pot still distillation. So all the bourbons are always double pot distilled. All the rye whiskeys are always double pot distilled. And that's because pot still distillation is all about retention and concentration of flavor. We do a lot of unique grains. We do oats. We do obviously wheat. We do buckwheat, kasha. We do a lot of interesting brewers malts, so honey malts, various roasted malts of different kinds, chocolate malt. We've got a chocolate malt corn whiskey that's coming out here shortly. The Lee Sinclair's got caramel malt in it. The William Dalton's got caramel malt in it. We use Victory malt on the rye whiskey. We use aromatic 30L for the Matty Glad. And so we play off a lot of those interesting flavor profiles you can get from brewers malts that you don't get otherwise out of distillers malts. We play around with a lot of different yeast strains. So all of our mainstream whiskeys actually use 2 different yeast strains. We propagate our own, what we call house yeast, which is our main yeast strain that we use. And that literally, it started off as Fleischmann's bread yeast back in the day. And a lot of people don't know this, but Fleischmann started off providing yeast to distillers. That was really their first job. And they had their own distillery as well. But we propagate that ourselves. And we've been doing that time after time after time for about 4 years now. And what we do is we divide our fermentations in half to where we're using 2 different yeast strains every single batch. So our system is set up as 600-gallon corn cooker or mash tun, 6 1,200-gallon fermenters, 1,200-gallon stripping still, 350-gallon doubling still, and 650-gallon doubling still. So the reason the cooker is smaller than the fermenters is so we can break up that fermentation. So day 1, we'll make 600 gallons of mash, put it in the fermenter, and we use that yeast I just mentioned to you, that house yeast that we propagate ourselves. Day 2, we actually throw in 1 of 3 different brandy yeasts, and those brandy yeasts are going to pull fruit flavors to the forefront. And the reason we're after that is because typically, if I mention fruit and I'm talking about grain, sometimes people think that's a little odd. But if you think about rye whiskey or high rye bourbon, a lot of times it can have a little like banana nut bread sort of aroma. Sometimes it can have a little like persimmon pudding, if you guys are familiar with that. All grains have the ability to give those kind of fruity profiles. Just a matter of finding the right circumstances with which to pull them out from that profile. We play around with a lot of historic yeast that I've gathered from old distilleries in the Black Forest region. So we've captured yeast strains from 2 of the existing buildings that still exist from the 155 distilleries I mentioned earlier, the McCoy Distillery and the Daisy Spring Mill Distillery at Springville State Park. And then we've also captured from the wild of places where there used to be other distilleries at. And so if we're running something like our Lee Sinclair 4 grain, which is 60% corn, 17 wheat, 13 oats, 10% caramel malt, if we do 50 runs of that in a season, the last 2 or 3 runs, we leave everything else the same. But what we'll do is we'll switch out that yeast strain for one of those other yeast strains that we captured from one of the old distilleries. And we know it's going to throw things off profile, but we're after that. We think of it as like a targeted single barrel. It's going to be off profile, and it's going to be on purpose off profile, so that people might want it as a single barrel, or maybe in a couple of years, you guys will be able to buy a gift pack of, say, 5 200 milliliter bottles of Lee Sinclair. And the only difference between them is the yeast strain. So you get like a real yeast study and you see how much yeast is actually affecting the flavor of bourbon or rye, because that's something that doesn't get talked about near enough yet in distillation in the United States, in my opinion. We're just now at the point where people are getting excited about heirloom grains again, and there's still a lot of depth. There's a lot more rabbit hole to go down with craft distillers in particular, and the kind of odd things that we're able to do. We do grow some of our own grain. So we grow about 30 acres of that corn I mentioned earlier. It's called Amanda Palmer, named after the lead singer of the Dresden Dolls. We grow about 30 acres of that on a farm in Martin County, and we use that for what we call our estate bourbon. I think it's going to end up being called Hindustan Falls, which was actually the name of this little town that got abandoned in Martin County. The farm, part of the town is on that farm that the Doty's own. We also do 15 to 30 acres of wheat every year on that farm that we use for various projects. Most everything else comes to us as local as what we can get it. The rest of the corn is going to be number 2 dent corn that's coming from Orange, Martin, and Du Bois County. The wheat's all going to be Southern Indiana, Southern Illinois centric. The rye we get from Brooks Grain, because honestly, Erica at Brooks Grain, I can call her up and I can say, hey, here's what I'm looking for as far as aroma and flavor goes. And Erica will make a blend of rye that works extremely well for what we're doing. As a matter of fact, she's about to send us some that had germinated just a little bit in the field for a historic project that we're working on. And there's a reason we wanted it germinated just a little bit in the field as well. We get our oats from a little mill down in Kentucky that's Amish owned, which is kind of cool. We grind everything right there on site every single day. We've got a hammer mill system, and we also have a seed cleaner. So we clean all the grain before it ever hits the hammer mill. And the reason for that's to kick out all the cellulosic material. A lot of people don't know this, but if you use any artificial, exogenous, outside enzymes whatsoever, other than just malt, there's a little bit of sugar that actually exists in, say, the gloom on the corn or in the cellulosic material on the corn, etc. And those enzymes can't tell the difference between that and an actual kernel of corn. So they'll break that stuff down and it makes more methanol, which we can get rid of during distillation by getting rid of our heads. But then it's just a waste product. Why are you going to make the extra and spend the extra fuel to separate it one way or the other? We take everything down to a real fine flour consistency. We want as much extraction of the flavor from that grain as what we possibly can. We typically leave a little residual sugar as well during the fermentation. So for those of you who are brewers and may or may not know this, like if we start at 1075 for Lee Sinclair, we'll probably finish it out at 1.010, which means there's a little residual sugar. It doesn't distill across, but what you get is these sort of aromatic precursors. You get these kind of starchy components that come across with the distillation that better represent what that grain was when it was ripe in the field. So we have 4 pillars. So bourbon, brandy, botanical spirits, so absinthe, gin, and aquavit, and then American whiskey, so rye whiskey, single malt whiskey. We've got some wheat whiskey put back. We've got some 100% oat whiskey put back. We tend to stay at a lower proof for barreling on most of the bourbons and ryes. We go in at 105. We also use a different type of barrel than a lot of people do. So we do a number 2 char. The reason for that is because the char itself isn't actually giving you the flavor. It's actually the toast that's underneath that char and the toast on the heads where you actually have those residual sugars that give you flavor. A 2 char as well tends to leave a little bit more lignin behind. So you get these kind of toasted coconut, toasted hazelnut sort of things that come from the barrel. As well, at 105, the alcohol is destabilized a little bit. So you get micro-oxidization a little bit differently than you do if you're at a higher proof. We don't use any small barrels at all. It's 53 gallon and larger. We do a lot of finishing, but we don't like to use a lot of like real strongly flavored barrels. Like I tend to like to keep my finishing barrels in and they be dry because I want that subtlety to come through from that product in particular. So right now we've got some high rye bourbon setting in some Espadine mezcal barrels. We've got some Lee Sinclair setting in some Espadine mezcal barrels. I kick back a lot of my own barrels and use them for stuff. So we actually did a New American Oak absinthe, and then we took those barrels and put rye whiskey in them and did a rye aged or matured in absinthe. We've done some apple that was matured the entire time in tequila barrel. We've done mead barrels, all that kind of stuff. Those are all fun projects for me. And I have and you guys will get to try it when you come to the distillery. I have a barrel that should be bottled by the time you get there and maybe available. But it's a sherry butt from Isla that was in Isla for 19 years. And we don't know what distillery it was at. But what we did is took 4-year-old apple brandy. We took 2.5 barrels of 4-year-old apple brandy and put it in an Isla barrel back in the springtime to make a smoked apple brandy. Because I don't know if there's anything like that out there on the market. And those are the kind of projects that we're into. We don't make any liqueurs at all whatsoever. Nothing sweetened. I literally took this distillery on the hardest path to monetization that I possibly could because I'll answer that question about the barrels momentarily. They originally wanted to start this distillery to do liqueurs and things like that. And I told them up front, I said, listen, you bought stills that are too big for what you're wanting to do. You're a 10 or a 12 state company easily. And also you sell sweet wine. So would you rather sell 1 bottle of your new liqueur that tastes like blackberry or continue to sell the 3 bottles of blackberry wine that you already have? Because people usually will not buy both of them. They'll buy one or the other. As far as the barrels, so yeah, we use Kelvin for a long time. And I love Kelvin. They're the last of the bigger companies that make barrels that still uses the leftover wood for part of the charring process, which I think is super important. Oh, great. My other dog's in here eating papers now. This is how professional my life is.
I'm sorry.
It's all good. So we use Zach cooperage a lot as well. And I really like Zach. So they're a smaller cooperage out of the old Athertonville distillery in Atherton, Kentucky. We like to use them because we can literally tell them if we have some oak that's on the farm and we want to use that for barrels, they'll come get it, they'll cut it, they'll season it, and do the whole thing for us. Right now, barrels have become kind of hard to find, and Zach has not fallen through on me once yet whatsoever. So I really respect that quite a bit. Our maturation process is probably a little different too from what you'll see elsewhere. So we don't have traditional warehouses like you would see in Kentucky. What we have instead is we now have 3 warehouses, one of which is actually built into the building, and it's not actively heated or cooled. It just passively works off the heating and cooling of the building. So it's 30 to 40 degree temperature differentials throughout the year, typically pretty high humidity. We get about 7% a year angel share out of that warehouse, which is probably enough to get me fired from anywhere else. But that also gives us a lot of retention and concentration of flavor. It never gets so cold in there that things stop aging. So we're able to mature things the entire time that's in there. If it's in there 4 years, it's literally in there, aging that entire 4 years. There's no chance for it to stop maturing at that point in time. That one is used primarily for brandies or anything more volatile, like oats tend to be pretty volatile. Buckwheat tends to be pretty volatile. And that volatility, you can actually lose that through the barrel as your aromatics. And about 90% of what you taste is in what you smell. So being able to hold on to those aromatics is super important. So that's what that room is used for. Secondarily, we have 2 barrel houses, and think of them kind of like a Scottish style dunnage, except they actually have a concrete floor and they have ventilation all the way around. So they'll get up to maybe 100, 110 degrees, whatever it is really outside at the time. They may get just a few degrees warmer than that, and they drop down to whatever the temperature gets to in the wintertime. So it's a much more dynamic aging environment. We found that in the warehouse that's connected to the distillery, anything with more than 70% corn or anything with rye in it does not respond well to that more brandy-like aging. So we use the other 2 warehouses for all the things with more than, say, 70% corn or anything with any rye in it to be a little bit more dynamic about the way that we do that. We don't do any chill filtration whatsoever. That's one thing that we've always avoided and always will. Oh, the other reason on the number 2 char that I mentioned earlier too is, since we are pot still, and this is part of my methodology, that char that's in the barrel in any whiskey is not there as a flavor thing. Like I said, it's the toast underneath of it that you're really after. The reason a lot of people go with a 3 or 4 char is because on column stills, low rec column stills like what you see in Kentucky, you're not able to make actual on the fly cuts like you do with a pot still. And subsequently, you end up with more acetaldehyde, ethyl acetate, some of the stuff that comes over in the beginning of the distillation. And you can literally volatilize that through the aging process, through the maturation process, but also that charcoal works as a filtering device in the barrel. So since we don't need to make those adjustments during maturation because we've already cut the whiskey where we want it at, we don't need that heavy char level that you might otherwise get. I'll touch real quick on some of the history. So we always say it's not just the spirits of the bottle, but the spirits of the place. I tend to have a more old world sort of approach to distillation, and it tends to lean a little bit more on the spiritual side of things. So one of the things that I love doing is I'm really a historian at heart. And the problem with being a historian is if you write an article, maybe 5 or 10 people will read that article and they'll really get it and they'll really enjoy it. So it becomes almost pointless. But if you then take a person from history in Southern Indiana who maybe didn't get their due and maybe their story's a little bit scandalous or it's interesting, whatever, you find a whiskey that matches their sort of ethos, what they were as a person, you put their picture on it, and then you tell their story in a blurb on the back of the bottle. I joke that it's almost like a form of necromancy, right? You almost bring these people back. Like nobody knew, 2, 3, 4 years ago, whatever, in New Orleans, who Lee Sinclair was or who Matty Gladden was. And now they all know who those characters are if they're familiar with our whiskey. And for me, there's a lot of satisfaction in that. And there's a lot of fun in being able to tell those stories that otherwise may not have gotten told throughout history. That comes all the way down to what I mentioned earlier with the history of distilling here in the Black Forest. So most early distillers that came to this region, as mentioned, they all came from that Black Forest region of Germany, or they all had ancestry there. So they brought the arts of brandy distillation and early on rye whiskey distillation, although rye didn't continue long here because it tends to get 6-7 feet tall. And much like you guys probably get a couple pretty good storms in June that tend to lay a lot of crops down. And that's what happens to rye here in Southern Indiana. So they very quickly moved over to corn. There were a lot of mills in Southern Indiana because it was still rural. And those mills were really kind of agricultural centers. Most of the settlers had a way to grind their own corn, but they didn't have anything to do with the excess corn. So these mills basically work as kind of a trading post. So you take your corn in, and they usually work on this weird 8-share system where you'd have 8 shares of corn, The miller would keep 3 and you'd get the other ones back. And when you got them back, you could have it back as either cornmeal or as finished whiskey. Subsequently, the miller was also a farmer, so he had his own corn and didn't have to worry about, having corn. But what they want more corn for is to be able to make more whiskey, which they're doing in the fall and then shipping downriver. The county that I'm in had 64 mills at one point in time, and every one of those mills had a distillery associated with it, and probably 2 or 3 smaller ones that were kind of roughly associated with it within the neighborhood. As early as 1818, we have a shipping receipt for Salem, Indiana, just up the road from me for 200 barrels that fall, just coming from the town alone, not the rest of the county. Ironically, when it comes to bourbon, we're kind of on the wrong side of the river over here with the bourbon thing. I'm kind of in bourbon's backyard. I'd almost be better off if I were in northern Indiana as opposed to just right across the river. I don't think I'd get as much shit if I was in northern Indiana or even in another state necessarily. But I always tell people there's nothing, people didn't come to the southern bank of the river, look across the northern bank and go, I don't know what's over there, but I'm not going. Right? That never happened. That was never a conversation. We have limestone just like they have in Kentucky. It's actually a better quality building limestone in Kentucky. The Empire State Building is built from it. Most of the buildings in Washington, D.C. The stone came from one county over from here. So same minerals, same pH in our water. Even that word bourbon is interesting, especially for you guys being from Ohio, because I don't think this gets mentioned very often. So the word bourbon doesn't show up until about 1823, 1824, 1825 to describe that style of whiskey. And that early style of bourbon, all bourbon really is a modified corn whiskey. So all of it's going downriver to be sold, and Kentucky gets credit for it, and they should get credit for it. But one thing that should always be remembered is that Southern Indiana, Southern Ohio both have the same culture. They have the same limestone. In fact, we say there's no such thing as Southern Indiana. It's Hoosier occupied Northern Kentucky until you get to about Columbus, Indiana, because then the culture changes, right? There's nothing wrong with kale and quinoa, right? But I sure like cornbread and grits an awful lot. It's just a cultural difference. It's almost 2 different states. But that being said, if you were making corn whiskey in Southern Ohio or Southern Indiana, and you wanted to ship it downriver in the days before the locks went in, you had to actually ship your barrels across the river to the Kentucky side, because unless you were south of Floyd's Knobs, Indiana, you would lose everything at the Falls of the Ohio. So you had to be able to bypass the Falls of the Ohio from the Kentucky side. So it could be that as much as 20-30% of that early bourbon whiskey was coming from Southern Indiana and Southern Ohio, and it wouldn't surprise me one way or the other. We have too long of a history of it. Most of the early distillers that were here in Southern Indiana, they were preacher distillers, which sounds incongruent. They were the Campbellite persuasion, so they were traveling from place to place, and they'd come to your house. They do last rites, they do funerals, they do marriages, all that stuff. It was not frowned upon at all around Southern Indiana to drink until maybe you get into the late 1840s. The temperance movement starts to grow along with the Civil War coming up. There's some connections there that are kind of interesting. But the preachers very early on saw that there was a need and a want for alcohol, not just to sort of relieve the stress of the day, but also as medicine, etc. And there was also a need and a want for physical church buildings. So very early on, the preacher distillers start distilling and selling whiskey and brandy in order to raise money for churches. And the vast majority of early churches in the 6-county region were actually built off of liquor money. It was also a great way to kind of keep an eye on your herd. So, if you're selling liquor to somebody on Saturday, you know who you might need to preach to on Sunday, but you also know who probably needs to be cut off, and you control the supply and demand. So you can kind of keep your flock in order, as it were. By the 1850s, that 6-county region that we're talking about, we tended to not really grow named apple varieties. We'd grow apples back from seed that had crossed back and forth. So each of the 6 counties had upwards of about 155,000 apple trees per county, which is pretty impressive. The distilleries were running anything from a little bitty distillery might make 2 barrels a year, and this is just on the apple brandy side. And the biggest one, which was the Alexander Sterling and David Kemper Distillery in Harrison County, Indiana, they were making about 1,200 barrels a year of apple brandy, which doesn't sound like a lot until you break it down and realize you're talking 3 bushels of apples to make 1 gallon of brandy. So from August until January of every year, they're running like crazy. The other interesting thing with Indiana was there was no excise tax here until 1862. We joined right after the first excise tax ended from the war, or second excise tax ended from the War of 1812. So now, by the time you get to 1862, you have 3 generations of very stubborn Germans who've never paid taxes on liquor, and a lot of them immediately moved underground. So, for example, if you have a distillery making 1,200 barrels, that's what is being reported that they made. But none of these distilleries were typically big enough to have a tax man on site. So the main tax office was actually not even in one of the 6 counties. It was in an adjoining county called Floyd County. And I don't suspect that the tax man made it very far away from the train tracks very often when he came this direction, would be my guess. You start to see even their families that were in the business for 3 or 4 generations, like the Wolfs that were in Orange County where Spirits of French Lick is. They were distilling for 3 generations up to 1862 in a place called Stillhouse Hollow, which was pretty hard to get to even back in the day. And in 1862, when the excise tax hits, they claim that that distillery burned down. They go about a half mile away along a new turnpike that's being built. They build a new distillery. And what you find out later on is that from 1862 up until 1930, up until Prohibition, they were running both still houses. One is a legal distillery and one is an illicit distillery. And the illicit distillery actually continued into the 1930s. So they were making their money kind of coming and going one way or the other. And I just kind of tell you all this stuff because a little bit of interesting background. The real thing that happened in Southern Indiana that kind of destroyed the industry for us is that the temperance movement was very, very closely aligned with what was called the Knights of the Golden Circle, what eventually became the KKK. These guys, there was a group of them. One, in fact, was from West Baden, French Lick, named William Bowles. He owned the hotel that Lee Sinclair later bought and turned into the West Baden Dome. And another one was the owner of the Salem Democrat newspaper in Salem, Indiana. These guys were literally tried for treason in the United States. They were going to kill Governor Oliver P. Morton. They were going to replace him with the lieutenant governor, who was a kind of a Southern sympathizer. They didn't really want Southern Indiana to become part of the Confederacy. What they wanted was Southern Indiana, Northern Kentucky, Southern Ohio, and Southern Illinois to kind of become its own sovereign country. But they're going to kill the governor, replace him with the lieutenant governor. They're going to release the prisoners of war from Anderson, Indiana, give them access to the armory. They got caught ordering in 300,000 guns that were confiscated in New York that were coming to Indiana labeled as, I believe, Bible study books. They end up basically with a slap on the wrist. They end up in jail for maybe 6 months. They get back out. They're back into the legislature of the state of Indiana very shortly thereafter. In the 1870s, they start introducing all these asinine laws and trying to get them passed. So one of them they tried to get passed was 2 guys are out drinking. They get into a fight. One of them kills the other one. The guy who killed the other one's not responsible. The guy who sold him the alcohol is not responsible. The guy who made the alcohol is the one who would be held responsible. And they wanted to use that as a preface to be able to take distilleries away and put them out of business. So by the time you get to 1914, what you see is 3 sort of things that are happening. So first of all, fire blight hits Indiana. Fire blight kills apple trees. So immediately you start seeing a lot of the apple trees die out. Secondarily, the Knights of the Golden Circle, they've now fully become KKK, and they're treating a lot of the local distillers just like they would African Americans. They're burning crosses in their yard. They're trying to shame them. They're trying to scare them out of the business and get them completely out of the business. The other thing that's happening is people see Prohibition is coming, and even though they know it's kind of a joke, they know that it's going to be the end of their lifestyle. So you got to bear in mind, these are all farmer distillers, and that operative word is farmer. 155,000 apple trees per each county in the 6-county region. And these are not apples that have been bred or selected to be to be eaten out of hand or even to be made into cider. They're brandy apples. So they're going to have to cut the trees down and plant commodity crops. West Baden and French Lick becomes interesting because it's always been sort of a resort town because of the unique groundwater we have there. It's a mineral water, and that's been its main claim to fame over the years. But it developed a sort of casino and gambling culture that was very prominent by the time of Prohibition. So during the time of Prohibition, there were actually 9 hotels and casinos in the valley. A guy named Charles Edward Ballard ended up owning 8 of the hotels and all 9 casinos. He ended up at one point in time owning every circus in the United States short of Barnum and Bailey. They actually overwintered the circus animals and the performers there. He had clubs in Michigan. He had a hotel in Chicago. He had clubs on the East Coast, clubs in Florida. He had one in Havana, Cuba, etc. And he was tied in pretty close with a guy named Diamond Jim. If any of you are familiar with any of the Chicago gangster history, Capone took over from Diamond Jim after having Diamond Jim killed. Ballard had these 2 large farms outside of town where he had actually bought a 400-gallon pot still from one of the old distilleries. And he literally was so brazen that he put the pot still within 20 feet of the railroad. They made moonshine. They pull the trains up. They'd load the trains full of moonshine, ship it around to all of his clubs throughout the United States and down to Cuba, etc. They actually used the West Baden Dome and Hotel as a meeting place for a lot of the Kentucky distillers and the Chicago outfits. As a matter of fact, Steve Beam has some pictures of both of his grandfathers at the hotel. And I suspect there were a lot of other Kentucky distillers that would have been seen around that hotel at the time. They tried to kind of bring the Indiana distillers into the fold, but the Indiana distillers were always a pretty independent lot, and they wouldn't put up with that. There's a story about one moonshiner in particular named Chester Smith, and Ballard kind of had the state police in his pocket. They'd busted Chester twice already. He was going up to Jasper and buying maybe 10 gallons a week or something. Then he was also making a couple gallons himself and selling it around the valley. And so they wanted to put him out of business because he's interfering with their business to some small degree. So he finds out that the cops are going to come for him again a third time. He hides all this stuff and he doesn't get busted. And he decides the morning after this is a Saturday morning. He's going to make sure that Ballard doesn't ever mess with him again. So he gets in his car and he drives down the road across from what is now the French Lick Hotel and Casino. There was another hotel and casino there that was called the Brown. And he pulls up and he knows that nobody's in the lobby, and he throws dynamite from out of his car into the front of the lobby and blows the lobby off the hotel. And at that point, Charles Edward Ballard was like, "Yep, don't fuck with Chester. Just let him sell his 10 gallons of moonshine, and because he's crazy." So that's kind of the background and the history. I think I did an okay rundown with that. So.
I have questions. Does anybody else have questions?
I'd say just start asking.
All right.
Yeah.
I have a couple questions, and maybe this will trigger everybody else. So you mentioned earlier about how like the title of like master distiller is more of like a marketing thing now.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that has just transitioned to like the past decade, being like, you know, if you go like, you know, 70s, 80s, 90s, you know, the master distiller was truly exactly what that definition is. But now it's more of a, you know, I'm not going to name specific brands, but, you know, you have like,
Absolutely.
You know, a third generation grandson that that is now the master distiller, but really was never really interested in that. Do you think that just kind of shifted recently because of the boom that comes along with whiskey?
So I think most of them, even in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, would have considered themselves operators more than master distillers, right? But yes, that's part of it is the boom, and then part of it is the marketing department needing somebody to be the face of the company. But that term was never used historically. It was yeast maker and distiller is what was originally the title, because keeping the yeast was the most important job that the distiller had by far. I would even also argue, and again, please, I hope no one takes this the wrong way. I love all the big Kentucky distilleries. For a long time, I argued that there should have just been two taxes taken out of my check every week, which were, I have a daughter, so the Disney tax, go ahead and take that out now and get it over with so I don't have to see it. And then the other one's the Heaven Hill tax, right? Which for a long time, that was my go-to. But I would argue that there are, even in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, this was true as well. These are all heritage brands. They all have sort of their process figured out, right? So my question to how I determine if somebody's actually could even be determined to be a distiller, a real distiller, a practical distiller is, do they understand beer math? Can they write a mash bill that actually works? Because anybody can write down percentages, but can you write a mash bill that actually works and can be made into a fermentable product without using any outside resources other than the enzymes that come from the malt? And I think that you would find that even amongst those big distillers, about 9 out of 10 of them have no idea. They don't. And that doesn't mean that they're bad at their job. It's just they've not had to think about their job in that way. And so for me as a small pot still guy and a more practical distiller based on 1800 stuff, like that's kind of the litmus test for me in a lot of ways.
So do you then view yourself more as like I mean, that sounds weird asking you that. Like, that sounds like you could give like an arrogant answer, but do you view yourself more as like an operator? Like what you had just referenced? rather than like
No.
what a quote unquote master distiller is?
No, I view myself primarily as truthfully a small scale farm pot still distiller is what I see myself as. I don't like the term master distiller because there's always something else to learn, right? And I definitely don't think I'm an operator, because the difference between running, say, a large low rec column still, there's a lot of programming that goes into that stuff nowadays, right? And the low rec column still was the product directly of industrialization in particular. And it obviously changed the game pretty tremendously, but they don't operate the same way that a pot still does. So they're a little bit more tuned in, right? A pot still, the reason I love pot stills and I could never work at one of the bigger companies is because a pot still will fight you. A pot still is reflective, it's percussive. Think of it like an acoustic guitar versus an electric guitar, right? The column still is an electric guitar. There's a lot of inputs. There's a lot of things that can cover up mistakes because you have so much input in there. It's a lot more consistent because it's easily controllable, versus a pot still being like an acoustic guitar, where if you mess up, somebody is going to know that you messed up. And you don't create consistency from a pot still because everything in the world affects it. If you come to our distillery in the wintertime and you taste the Lee Sinclair mash bill coming off the pot still, we're getting some more natural reflux. And so we're getting a little slightly higher proof in the wintertime than we do in the summertime. And subsequently, that whiskey that we make in the summer is a little lighter style than what we make in the wintertime. So you don't manage your consistency through the distillation process. You manage it by blending thereafter. And for me, that's the fun of it. I like that you have to be on your toes. You have to be paying attention to what's happening. You can't simply just set it and forget it. And these are the parameters, and this is where we distill out the exact same way every single day. To me, that's an operator's job. Yeah.
So do some people may not understand what heirloom grains are?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to explain what those are?
Yeah, absolutely. So typically heirloom grains, heirloom anything, there's not any real great definition here. They tend to be things that have been considered valuable enough seed wise to have been saved by previous generations and passed to the next generation. Now they could be what are called open pollinated seeds, which are seeds that come back true to themselves every year. They could be, let's say, maybe they started off as a hybrid. So, you get your Burpee catalog in the mail, and every year Burpee has a new tomato, and you know that you can't save the seeds because it won't come back true. Well, if you keep saving the seeds and grow out enough plants and keep looking for something that looks real similar to that first one, that's how you make a hybrid into an open pollinated. It could even be that. It could be old commercial varieties. That are no longer offered in catalogs, but they were so important to the people that were growing them, they were held on to for years. And that's very much the same thing with these distilling varieties. But the thing that really hurt us with these distilling varieties is that you had a couple of states that went completely out of business. A, Indiana, short of Seagram's, and B, Pennsylvania was basically wiped off the face of the planet during Prohibition. And subsequently, a lot of that rye disappeared. The rye diversity disappeared from there, and the apple diversity disappeared from here in southern Indiana. So
I caught most of that. Our new dog that we just rescued is fighting with our old dog, and
I feel you, man. I got the same thing.
Trying to keep them off of each other. So hopefully this next question makes sense, but like choices are like, choices of products are always good.
Mm-hmm.
But I noticed like a lot of times like brewers, like especially in the state of Ohio, transition from being, they don't transition, they bring new products from going from a brewery and they add distillation process. Do you think that outside of like, when you ask that question to like a lot of like the larger distillers and stuff, you're like, what do you think about that? They're like, oh, it's great, it brings more product onto the market and whatever else. But just because you're a brewer doesn't always mean that you're going to be good at being a distiller. Do you obviously because that process is different, do you feel that same way, or do you think it's like good that you're getting like, we have a brewery locally called we'll just say we have a brewery locally. They started distilling a few years ago. It's actually with Bill Hockey. I think you know who he is, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Bill's one of my best good friends, as Forrest Gump says.
Yeah. So he reminds me of you. So, but like they put out good stuff, but a lot of times they always like source at the beginning too, because that's just how the process works. Like, most everybody here should already know that. But do you think that being a distiller, let me try to figure out how to word this. You think being a distiller will lead to better success than going from being a brewer to a distiller? Because like the way that process is different, and the way that like palates and tastes and the way all that turns out, the impatience behind it.
I think I think the more important thing at this point in time, because I'm all for opening up distilleries everywhere, because what people don't realize is prior to Prohibition, you're dealing with a population that was roughly 20 times smaller than what we currently have, but yet had almost 200 times as many distilleries, right? And these were not all big distilleries, but they were small, localized, regional distilleries that played into the local food shed, local culture, local tradition. That's what vastly excites me, because now we're finally at a point where, and bourbon drinkers are bourbon drinkers, right? But bourbon drinkers are curious, and they're getting more and more curious. That's why some of the craft brands are starting to catch on with traditional bourbon drinkers, and they're getting the traction they do, because people are getting more curious about these things. That to me is exciting. And I think the more important thing is that they become good distillers, well-rounded distillers, and that they don't try to copy everybody else. Because the biggest thing that I see right now is, I could take you to 5 or 6, maybe even 7 distilleries between, let's say Kentucky, Illinois, Indiana, maybe even Ohio. And I can tell you that all the people who own and run those all went to the same place to get their education, which was a very limited education. The place does a great job for what they do, but a week is not making you a distiller. All right. And that place tends to set people up with their consultants. And so what you have is these 6 or 7 distilleries, all using the same consultants, all using the same grain sources, all using the same exogenous enzymes, all using the same yeast. They all use pretty much the same architect, because they all have pretty much the same building. They have the same fermenters and the same stills. And in 5 years, I don't think any of them is going to matter. I don't think they'll matter at all.
Is that place in Indiana?
Not in Indiana, but it's in Louisville. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because the place that's
not
in
so
Indiana,
famous university.
Right. And I don't mean that as a knock to those people, because I do like them and they do a good job, but there needs to be some more diversity.
What place was that? I didn't hear what somebody had said.
It's Moonshine University.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Anyways, so do you guys have an apple brandy finish?
So I have 2 barrels of rye whiskey set in an apple right now. Basically, every time I dump something out of a barrel, I try to find a way to reuse that barrel, for sure. So I don't think we've done any bourbon and apple yet, but I do have some. I've got some Matty Gladden setting in some Catawba brandy barrels, ironically. So those of you who are familiar with, obviously, with Ohio wine or Midwest wine in general, you'll probably be familiar with Catawba.
So farmer distillers, being like, what are they? What's the new term now? It's like field distill or whatever. You always hear them. You think that term is what they're trying to replace farmer distillers as? Because when I think of a farmer distiller, I think of exactly that. Like, you get done at the end of the day, you take your grain, you end up distilling your product, and then you go to bed at night. But like
Right.
Recently, you're hearing, I don't think field distill is the right term, but it's like we
Grain
get
grain to glass. Yeah.
grain to glass. Yeah. You think that's the term that is trying to be marketed to replace that?
I think so, very much so, and it's very much in the vein of that, and I do love seeing that. Like, and listen, I think we all kind of know this. Very few distillers have the capability of growing all of their own grain, right? But I think even just the importance of having a product made with your own grain, if you can, or grain that is grown locally by another farmer. I think that's super important, especially if you want to explore the idea of terroir and whiskey in particular. The idea that the area that it's grown in, the particular variety that it is, has a representation that comes off differently in distilling.
I have a couple more that are kind of cool. So what's your guys' output like on average? Like, obviously you're like, how many states are you in? Obviously you're not in the state of Ohio yet, but you're spreading out farther. So output obviously dictates like where you're located and how far you are across the United States. So like, tell us a little bit about that.
So right now we are in 12 states, and we're about to get some single barrels into Ohio. Ironically, we talked about this a little bit before we started, but it's harder to get harder to get into Ohio than it was Canada. We're also in Canada now, which is pretty cool. We have a great distributor up there, and they both have a great personality because they're Trailer Park Boys fans, and I'm a Trailer Park Boys fan. I'm South Park, and they love Rush. And hell, they sent me 12 packs of Rush beer just so I could distill it and see what that did. But so we produce basically, depending on the mash bill during the week, we're doing something with wheat in it, which is we can get more yield off of. We'll yield 4.5 to 5 barrels every 2 days. So maybe 12 to 14 barrels a week at max. And if we go down to rye whiskey, you can't run as thick of a mash bill on rye because it gets very thick and it gets hard to work with. So with rye whiskey, every time we run, we're getting about 2 barrels. So when we kick over to rye whiskey, we basically lose half of our production pretty easily. So
Jeremiah has a question.
Yeah, so you touched on finishing bourbons and whiskeys a couple of times, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, because that seems to have gotten crazy lately. I think the first one everybody has is that one from down on Whiskey Row, but seems like there's another distillery in Indiana that I drink a little bit of bourbon from as well that does a whole bunch of finishing and a little bit of everything.
They do a lot. Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. They do a ton of it. Yeah, there's a lot of it out there, and I think everybody has a different approach to it, right? So for me, with this distillery in particular, my approach has always been like, we're going to do this the hard way, and we're going to be as legitimate about it as what we can. And so I tend to take, Vinny, you are familiar with Richard Seal of Foursquare Rum. He and I share a similar sort of idea with finishing, which is, if you're going to finish, it's about, to me, it should be, if you're going to be traditional.
You can send some of that Foursquare my way.
Right. It should be about subtlety. I love that stuff. And I'm not even a rum person, but damn. Yeah. It should be about subtlety to some degree, right? So these finishing barrels that people get in, like when we get finishing barrels in, I want them empty. I want them dry. I don't want the barrel falling apart, but I want them dry. I don't want there to be a gallon of stuff in there. I don't want a half gallon. I don't want any more in the wood than there has to be. I want the subtlety to come through. I want my whiskey to still be there. And I think that the mistake sometimes that people make, and I think it even sometimes, and obviously some consumers don't care, but I think traditional whiskey drinkers do care. The mistake a lot of people make is that they don't care if there's 3 or 4 gallons of liquid left in there, right? Which should change the type of spirit it is to begin with. And they don't care if it overruns the flavor of their actual whiskey. So a good example would be, a lot of us are now playing around with Amburana wood. And I love Amburana. I don't know if any of you have ever had any of that or not, but the mistake a lot of distillers make is they'll go into a full-on Amburana barrel. And unless your whiskey has really got some heft to it, you're not going to taste that whiskey when it comes back out of the barrel. You're going to taste Amburana, and that's it. So we've done a lot of experimenting with using Amburana chips to post-age, post-mature some whiskey with, as opposed to the barrel, because the barrel just becomes too much. It's too forward. But even with the barrels that we reuse, so the absinthe barrels, when we dump those and we put rye whiskey in, not only did we dump them and make sure they were completely empty, we let them set for a couple weeks, let all the absinthe sweat out of them, and then dump that as well. So that way you're getting the subtlety of the absinthe, and that rye whiskey can still come to the forefront.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think finishing should be regulated? Because there is some of that backstory with Good Times, like, you know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah, I'm not saying that's true or that's false.
No, I know. Yeah, I understand completely where you're at there. Honestly, as a moonshiner, I'm going to say that I'm never for regulation. But what I do think is interesting is I think that people, as their palates become more educated, they'll regulate those companies through the market. That's what will happen. And I think that's a better option than asking the TTB to write up a definition and regulate it. They're having a hard time regulating things as it is. So I'm not sure that solves anyone's problems. And again, you can only, and not pointing a finger at anybody here, you can only fool people so many times before they catch on and it shows up in the marketplace. And I'm not saying that those guys did that. I'm just saying in general, there are people that do that for sure.
Is it hard to be critical of other distillers in the industry?
No, I'm pretty damn mouthy if you watch my social media. I'm trying to be better about it nowadays than I have been in the past, because it doesn't necessarily always do you a lot of favors. So
I feel like the same way. I feel like, when we like as groups, like around, US or whatever, like, somebody will post up something and like the backstory, that, I mean, I don't think everything's trash, but like if it's something that's really bad, you don't want to deter somebody from like going down that path, but at the same note, like you kind of be honest and be like, this is not the greatest, or, don't support these dudes or whatever. But yeah.
The stories are as bad as the finishes sometimes. You know what I mean? Like if I hear like one more story about my grandpa and his grandpa and his grandpa, and it's the same story, like, and I touched on the moonshining thing here with you guys, and maybe it's just because my story is different, because I knew all the things I saw them do, but it wasn't like there's no damn family secret about it. It was literally like, go to the store and get some sugar, and go to the feed store and get some corn, and you mix it together, and there you go.
Yep.
So
I see guitars behind you. What do you play?
Mm-hmm. If it's got strings, I can probably play it to some degree. Maybe not with the most confidence in the world, but to some degree.
Like what kind of music do you play? Is it?
So I would say mostly like alternative rock sort of thing. Maybe leaning into like going a little heavier on acoustic guitar. But very much so like the pot still thing. I don't have an electric guitar, and not that I wouldn't have one, but I just love acoustic guitars. So this one right here with the old Universal Monster stickers on it, you can't tell because I have the world's worst webcam. That one is a Harmony Sovereign from 1957. I bought it at a flea market. I bought it because it's got a little tag in the sound hole, and it says Sunshine Sound Studios, Louisville, Kentucky, and gives the address. And so I did some research on that, and this was this little kind of hole in the wall studio that was kind of on the West End. But a lot of the old R&B acts from the 50s and the 60s, if they were on tour and they needed to cut a single or a demo, that was where they would stop into. And so who knows who all has actually played that old acoustic guitar, and it's beat all to hell, and I've had the super glue pieces of it back together and all that stuff, and I love it that much more for it. So
what are the chances of you, Patrick Heist, and Bernie Lubbers getting together, forming a band, and touring the United States and stopping distilling?
As long as we don't have to cover Slayer, I'm good. Yeah, I just saw Pat yesterday.
I was gonna say, you're out of luck, man.
I know,
nobody covers Slayer, right? I mean,
right.
they're the original, right? So
yeah, I give Pat shit all the time that I've never been a Slayer fan, but so every time I see him, I'm like, Megadeth's better, right? You get that.
You have lost your mind.
So I have
Megadeth, right? So
I don't know. There's only one guy that can say he was in both bands. So
yeah, that is true, Dave.
Yep.
Dave and his issues, right? So
right.
I do have a question from Brandon. If whenever he wants to chip in, he can.
Yeah. I was going to say, I'm just lobbying for Megadeth brandy. I've been doing that for years now, right? If Metallica has bourbon, next the best thing to Metallica money is Megadeth money. So, Dave, if you need a brandy, come to Indiana.
Absolutely. Well, I was going to say, so what do you feel about the celebrity stuff, right? I mean, that's become the new norm, right? You got Peyton Manning, you got Metallica, you've got, Bob Dylan and all these other celebrities. I mean, would you guys take an endorsement?
I think it would depend on who it was, right? Especially, building our distillery up the way that I have and trying to stay with those traditional sort of things. Like if it was somebody I felt like actually had artistic merit and they wanted a hand in it and they could actually be a part of it, I think there's some levity to that, but they have to actually be a part of it. And we've had some offers from some people with names out there, but honestly, it would have been probably pretty easy money overall. But if they're not really involved, and you do one thing goofy in this industry, and people will remember it forever, right? And again, you'll see it reflected in sales, especially if you're a craft distiller.
Do you ever plan on getting out of that craft distiller? Do you guys ever have plans to get out of that space, I guess, and get into being a mega distiller?
I don't own anything. But here's what I would say: as long as I am there, there will never be a column still there. They can drop in as many pot stills as they want to and hire some more distillers, and because that's my thing. And I'll always be, no matter where I'm at, that's my thing. It's always going to be a batch system. It's always going to be. I always say, for me, the chase is almost more fun than the catch. Like that line from the Joker, like a dog chasing cars. I wouldn't know what to do with it if I caught it. So
It almost sounds like, a lot of smaller distillers or craft distillers always start off with like a pot still.
Mhm.
You could be the Dave Pickerel of craft distillers around the United States, man.
I think I'm trying to work that direction. That's the goal, right? I'd rather be, no offense to Buffalo Trace, but I'd rather be, the McKellen of American whiskey. I'm okay with that.
Yeah. So, Marty, you got a question?
Well, it's not so much a question as a story of two guys working in Vandalia who skipped a meeting one day and went to Richmond to a place called Papa Joe's.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
Chris, you're in here, so yes, I'm telling on you. And so these two guys, we go to Richmond. We go to this liquor store, and we walk in there, and there's all these barrels of this juice I've never heard of or seen before. And this little girl in there saying, "Oh, you got to try this." And I'm like, "What is it?" She's like, "Oh, look at this. This is fantastic. This one especially, the William Dalton." And so I'm looking at the label. I'm like, pot stilled. I'm like, flashbacks of Boone County. I'm like, maybe. She's like, no, it's worth it. And I'm like, okay, I'll give it a shot. So I buy a bottle. We drive back to Dayton. I crack it open that night and immediately know that I'm getting ready to max out a credit card. So we drive back the next day and got all of them, which I have here: the Lost River.
You got the Lost River. Wow. Yeah.
Heard all about that.
Gladden, the Whiskey Witch. I got the Sinclair and the Dalton.
You
And
got
multiple. Yeah, I spent some money. You're welcome.
You got all the hidden characters. That's what I call the whiskey,
Yeah.
the Whiskey Witch and the Lost River. Those are
fantastic.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I think Sinclair's my favorite. I'll be honest. It's fantastic. It's and the Witch. I'm a little bit of a proof whore. So that does it for me. I don't want the baby. Or the journey. I just want the baby. So that's a quick place to go. So anyway, big fan, by the way.
Thank you.
And whilst we're there, a guy showed me a honey that you had.
The honey barrel.
Yeah. Did you have one on the honey barrel? Okay.
Yeah. So mead barrel from Hyven Barrel Meadery in Louisville. Really good friend of mine, Joel Hallaby. Even if you guys are ever in Louisville, go check out that place. He makes excellent mead.
So no amount of bribing could get that bottle out of his hand. But he did share with us a double chocolate malt that you had.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So that one, we haven't released that mainstream yet. I think we've done a couple single barrels of it. It should be out next spring. As far as it'll be a mainline product. I reuse a lot of the bourbon barrels for that because I like to reuse barrels, as we talked about. But listen, if you're doing corn whiskey in the United States, you get one of two directions, right? You either get mellow corn, which I absolutely love, but I'm never going to compete with mellow corn. Or you get Iron Root Republic, which I absolutely love, and I have no desire to compete with those guys at all. They have caused me more good times and hangovers in the past 2 years than I care to talk about because I love their stuff so much. So what we did instead is we tried to, we don't have anything, price-wise, it's hard for a craft distiller to get into bars, right? Because they can't really afford to buy you unless it's a craft bar, a high-end bar, and put you in the well. So I thought, well, let's do a corn whiskey and keep the price down on it, but let's do it in an interesting way. And so the interesting way to do that was to take malted chocolate malt, which is malt that's been roasted to a degree where it looks like coffee beans. And it has these roasted dark chocolate notes, roasted coffee notes. And we went in at 10% chocolate malt and 90% corn. And so the goal really is that the corn is basically there as kind of a filler. Honestly, it's ethanol. That's what that corn is there for. And the chocolate malt and the used barrel are the flavor. And so the idea was that this would be a really unique corn whiskey that we could kind of keep the price down on, but still have high quality double pot distilled corn whiskey and have a really unique flavor that nobody else out there has. And honestly, when I first did it, I think we did like 4 or 5 barrels and I thought it was going to be a joke. And then like 6 months into it and tasted it, I was like, nope, this is now a thing. This is yep, this is happening every time I have 20 or 30 empty barrels.
Right.
It's a great thing.
Yeah, he has a pick from you from the double chocolate malt, and he's just waiting on the stickers. And I already told him set aside a case. I want a case.
Good.
And so what I was wondering, because I had it and it was fantastic, and I was thinking, do you do picks of that specific bourbon or whiskey? I'm not really even sure which one it is, but and do you take PayPal or Venmo?
If I owned anything, yes, I would take PayPal and Venmo in a heartbeat. If I'm the one doing the pick, so here's the thing: like you guys would be, people that are coming to the distillery to do a pick, and I'm going to make sure. And you may have to remind me of the date because I've gotten so busy with production. A lot of times I don't get to do barrel picks, but I'll go out of my way to make sure I'm part of that one. A lot of times, if I'm on a pick with you, I tend to do things a little bit differently than the other people do picks. So we'll just go into the warehouse. And as long as I think it's something that's in the maturity range it needs to be in, you can literally point at a barrel and be like, well, that number's special, or what does that taste like? And we'll drill the barrel right then and there and see what's going on with it. And I think those are a lot more engaging picks than what you normally get where you go somewhere and they've already kind of rolled out or even pulled samples of the 5 or 6 barrels that are for sale. And we do a lot of them by mail as well. And we're going and pull, people tell us what products they're interested in. We'll go pull 4 or 5 samples of each of them and send them.
Yeah, like we don't like people have asked me, they're like, what are we picking from you guys? And my response is I don't know yet. Like I know that most of the ladies are planning an overnight. So like because you're just in that range to where we learned recently when we went down to Yellowstone. Well, not recently, it was like September. We went to Yellowstone, like Christy and Jessica and stuff. It's not always, we had a driver, but it's not wise. A 3-hour drive back. you're all asleep by the time you get back home. So, but I think the ladies and stuff are all spending the night overnight. I know my wife is gonna be along for the ride, but little Nashville is pretty close to you guys. So.
And honestly, staying in French Lick is a cool place to stay too. If you can afford to stay at the Dome or anything like that, and even if you don't stay there, you should make sure that you go there and walk into it and see it for what it is and the architecture of it and the beauty of it and the thought that went into it. It was the largest freestanding dome in the world until the Superdome was built. It was literally every engineer Lee Sinclair went to told him it couldn't be done until they found a 20-something-year-old engineer who had never actually built anything, and that's the one that pulled it off. So
so Jamie and Jess and Christy, you guys pass that along, whatever you guys decide. None of us guys are going. So Chris, do you have a question too about the chocolate?
Oh wait, if you have a bottle of the honey sitting around, I want to complete my collection.
I'll have to look in the Alan was probably slightly drunk at work and brought a partial bottle home archive and see if I have anything.
I'm open for open bottles for sure.
I have to taste through 15 or 20 things before I find it, because somehow those things never get labeled.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
So
do you feel, are you starting to feel the like quote unquote pressure of Spirits of French Lick growing, like the growth of it now, or is it not?
No, because for me it's all like surprising in the first place, right? Like I don't know. I feel like I spent like the 2 years at Copper and Kings. I felt like I spent there like just spinning my wheels to some degree. Like I was in the industry, but I wasn't where I wanted to be. And then like the first 3 years at Spirits of French Lick were like, that might have been a mistake, right? So when something good happens, I'm like, whoa, holy shit, that actually worked. They're paying attention to that. That's a thing. So yeah, it doesn't.
Like I said, I'm a huge fan. I have a ton of bourbon. And not all of it I like, and all these are fantastic. So
thank you, I appreciate that greatly. So Yeah, I try not to, I don't know. I always tell people about the industry too. I think, so obviously, I sat here and I rambled to you guys for an hour about the history, and it was fairly serious and all that stuff because some of you don't know the story and I wanted to get it out there. But I think the other mistake that happens in the industry in general, and listen, it's business and it is big business. There's big money in alcohol. Everybody takes it way too seriously. Like I always joke, like none of us distillers are curing cancer. Not a one of us. Like we're all just, some of us are full on alcoholics. Some of us are just like barely functional human beings in the first place. Like the only other talent that I have in this world is digging ditches, and I don't want to do it. So, I'm happy to be where I'm at. So,
Hey, I tried some of that Iron Root this weekend.
yeah.
Yeah, I was at a tasting with them and it was pretty phenomenal. I got to meet the lady that runs it, and it's
Oh
a
yeah,
pretty cool story.
the first lady of whiskey. Yes.
Yes, yeah.
She's
That's
the
pretty
good
fun.
people. Yeah. What'd you get to try? The Harbinger, Prometheus, anything in
Yes,
particular? Yep.
yes. The Saints, the two Saints ones that they have now. And that they're chocolates, which they just have a
Mhm.
chocolate that has that center, pure like whiskey center to it, which
Yep.
was amazing. So that was fun.
So yeah.
I have a question for you, and this may sound really stupid, but I hear a lot about terroir. I have no idea what that is. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. It's basically this idea of the taste of a local place, right? This idea
Okay.
that the minerals in the soil, the environment, the environmental stress on the crop, etc., that all those things are unique to a certain place and a certain time and a certain season. And so traditional pot still distillation, that's the word spirits itself comes from the spiritual idea, the idea that you're gathering the essence of what this thing was when it was ripe in the field and trying to hold on to it. And that's very much so what you're trying to do there. Like with apple brandy, for example, it would be not only the base idea, which would be, hey, can I capture what an apple is at the height of the season so that I can enjoy it out of season in like January or February, but also that particular gnarly looking tree over there that got beat up by the storm that came through this spring that's, growing on really shallow, very mineral rich soil. Can I get all of that, and can it remain as a representation even if you mature it into something else? And that's really the goal there.
Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Jamie's also one of the people that are gonna be attending as well. So we're one of the ladies. I'm always never quite sure whether they're called ladies or women or girls or whatever, but we'll just call it ladies. So somebody
I
else have
found
a
that
question?
bourbon women are pretty we're pretty laid back about what you call us, as long as it's not something bad.
Right.
Females makes me feel like I'm like 20 years old again. So my wife has pointed that out a couple times, like don't say females. So
Yeah, I may have to at the very least when you come to the distillery, I'll tell you the Maddie Gladden story, because that's one that you'll appreciate. So
I had a question about like your you mentioned maturation periods and things like that.
Mhm.
Do you have a set timeline in which you want to pull a barrel, or is it truly strictly by feel and taste?
So, still being fairly young, it'll be you will have been distilling 7 years in April. The goal was always to get to bottled and bond, which to me, there's at least some assurance that some amount of work and effort went into that whiskey if you get to bottled and bond, at least as a craft distiller. I feel like there's still at least enough public perception of what that means that it had some inherent value. I know my distillation style well enough to know that I can get away with hold on to a lot of that grain flavor. Now that doesn't mean that everything will always be just 4-year-old bottled and bond. So the Solomon Scott, for example, is a 5-year-old bottled and bond rye. I believe this last barrel dump of Lee we did, and the last one of Maddie, both ended up being 5 years instead of 4 as well. So it is aging forward a little bit, although we're selling through it so fast, it's hard to do that. So what I typically do if I'm going to do a bulk dump, for example, and I know I want the age range at 4 years or 5 years, depending on which one I have on hand, we'll literally pull down 30 or 40 barrels, and I will go through every single one of them if it takes me 2 or 3 days. And when I say I go through them, it's not just smelling, it's tasting, and it's actually, I take my time because I'm actually going to drink it too, because the finish is a big part of it, and you don't get the finish if you don't drink it. Probably not the smartest move from a health perspective, but it is what it is. So a lot of it does depend on, what are the representative characteristics of that particular whiskey. Like with Lee Sinclair, there's 4 profiles that tend to come out. And it's either like the most base profile is that sort of barrel forward Kentucky profile, right? And then the next profile is there's this almost like minty eucalyptus sort of characteristic we get on a lot of our whiskeys that comes from the house yeast. The next characteristic is sort of this floral, almost jasmine sort of characteristic. And then the one that I wish I could figure out how in the hell we're getting it, and I haven't been able to break this down yet. And it shows up in every whiskey that we have, but it's maybe only 1 barrel out of 20. I don't think it's related to the wood, specifically because with those Zach Cooperage barrels, we're still finding it. And a lot of times those barrels are, you might have 2 or 3 barrels from the same, or with staves from the same trees. But we get this crazy sort of phenolic Ceylon cinnamon, like cinnamon toast crunch thing that happens. So, and if I could figure out how in the hell to actually do that every time, I would.
Yeah, cinnamon whiskey seems to go well together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'm just curious, do you ever find a honey barrel where you're like, man, this is pretty damn good, but I wonder what this will be like if we let it go another year or get to that 8 to 10 year range? Do you guys have any plans to get any of those, or have any kind of hold some of those back?
Yeah, so I held on to a whole lot of 2017 Lee Sinclairs, like 30 barrels, because they were all phenomenal. And I'm real curious to see what they do at 6 years or 7 years. And then also, here's the like weird ego thing that comes out in me. So if you are any of you guys familiar with Mic Drop, have you guys seen this stuff? So they buy whiskey and they bottle it and they sell it mostly in the New York market. And I guess the guy that runs it, he's kind of a famous DJ up there. But so there were 2 barrels that myself and my father, the first 2 legal barrels of bourbon that I ever made, my dad did too, that were made at Copper and Kings. And they are the Lee Sinclair mash bill, the same mash bill that I've been using since I was 15 years old. They were made at Copper and Kings, barreled in 62-gallon Bordeaux barrels. And at some point in time, I guess Copper and Kings sold those off to this guy. So this guy literally has them priced at $1,250 a bottle, right? Which I made the whiskey, and I'm just going to tell you right now, $1,250 a bottle is ludicrous, right? Then the other part of me is also wants to brag about it because it's $1,250 a bottle. So I'm going to see if we can't get some 6 or 7 year Lee Sinclair for closer to $100, $120 a bottle, which to me, listen, bourbon's a blue collar drink. It always has been. So I tend to look at anything over $100. I'm like, I'm not sure if I would buy that or not, unless it's something vintage. But yeah, I mean, if you can get $1,250 out of it, you surely can get $100 out of it, and surely more people than just the very small handful that will buy a $1,250 bottle of whiskey will be able to enjoy it. So
I'll still take the barrel.
okay. All right. Perfect.
Did you guys, with all that, during all the COVID stuff, did you guys run into any shortages of things such as glass and grains and things like that, and it forced you to try new things? And like along those same lines, do you have any experimental stuff that you're like, well, let's see what this is going to do?
Oh man, you're on the same track I was. I was about to ask, do you guys have any experimental stuff going on?
Yeah, so we have all kinds of experimental stuff. Some of it's experimental finishing, some of it is like, so there's another version of Lee Sinclair that people don't know about yet, that we didn't do a whole lot of, but we do a little bit of it every couple of years. So it's an inverted Lee Sinclair. It's called Lillian Sinclair, named after his daughter. So we switch out the wheat for rye, and we switch out the caramel malt for honey malt. And then we actually use a lagering cave underneath St. Louis when we were out in St. Louis for that particular whiskey. There's a lot of experimental stuff in there, a lot of weird stuff in there. The first couple of years that we were going, might be bored on a Tuesday, and like maybe next door the winery has like, you know, tank bottoms where they have the leaves left over, all the yeast and everything, and the juice that fell out of the wine. They used to just put that down the drain. And I told them, like, I saw them come through with it one time. I'm like, what are you doing with that? They're like, we're going to get rid of it. I'm like, nope, no, you're not. Bring it in here, and I'm running it through the still and do a single pass on it and see what kind of flavors we can get out of it. And I think we've got a barrel that ended up on accident being half Lee Sinclair and half basically grappa. We had another one that on accident was half blackberry brandy and half rye whiskey, I think. So there's mistakes, and then there's also just rarities and weird things like that. With the COVID thing, and we're still dealing with some of this, but bottles have become an issue, not only just because of COVID, but also because the big guys have clamped down on bottles, or they've gotten what they need, and that kind of runs everyone else short. But the other thing that's happening is a lot of your bottles come out of Eastern Europe. And with this whole Ukraine and Russia thing, a lot of the gas to fire that glass comes out of Russia. And so that's been cut off going to a lot of those Eastern European plants. And so glass is becoming a big issue. And the problem we have is we use a bottle called the Arizona bottle, which a lot of other people use. And we could switch to a different bottle, except we already have several 100,000 labels that match that bottle. So you can imagine what kind of expense that was. The bigger thing has become whiskey barrels in general. I'm still not sure what's going on there, other than I think the big guys are a lot of them, and there's been a lot of expansion, right? Bardstown Bourbon expanded, etc. There's a lot of big distilleries going in, Lock Still. And I think the bigger guys are able to go to the cooperages and say, hey, over the next year, we're going to buy however many hundreds of thousands of barrels we're going to buy, right? And it locks them in at that price. And so the loyalty for the cooperage tends to lean a little bit towards those larger producers, because they know they're going to be able to sell, you know, a truckload of 300 barrels every day, you know, to those people versus selling me 50 barrels every month.
And they don't take into consideration your loyalty to them, even being a craft distillery, right?
Right. And so far, that's the one thing I'll say is Zach Cooperage has taken care of us big time. I've never once had a problem. They may sometimes be hard to get a hold of because they're busy and it's a small family-owned thing. But if I call and leave them a message, and if I call them tomorrow and say I need 50 barrels in 2 weeks, they're going to be there in 2 weeks. Even if I don't hear from them, they're going to be there.
Have you guys ever like made whiskey for anybody?
So, yeah, kind of. We made a white whiskey for a client. We don't do a lot of contract distilling because we've been lucky enough to stay busy the whole time. But we did a project, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago for a guy that wanted to make a white whiskey based on some outlaw biker stuff. And the goal was, I think, he wanted to make basically a light whiskey that was unaged. So distilled up to, I think, 170 was the base proof for it. So we ran it on the pot still with a deflator, but no plates, and held it there. And it was primarily, I think it was corn, oats, and I think there's a little bit of barley malt in it. But that's really the only contract distilling we've ever done. We sold some barrels to other projects, like we did. We just recently did the American Mash and Grain Borrowed Page project, which I absolutely loved, and I would love to see more of those kind of projects come along, especially with blending craft whiskey. And to me, those make more sense because we don't have any problems selling our whiskey. And I want to be a part of those projects, but I want to make sure that our logo always ends up and our credit always ends up on the bottle one way or the other.
Yeah, there's blended whiskeys, you know, where you take different distilleries, put them together. They sometimes turn out really great, and then other times they sometimes fall flat, right? So
yeah,
it's always interesting seeing those cool projects.
And that was worrying for me until I got to taste it. And that one I was extremely proud of. I felt like our I don't know, it's almost like watching your kid grow up, right? How well do they play with other kids? And Lee Sinclair played very well with those other whiskeys for sure.
Yeah, you feel it's because of the 4 grains and the variety within the 4 grains and things that gives it kind of play nicely with everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. Very much so.
Is there any so well, before I ask, does anybody have any other questions?
Chris, did you want to give him your tasting notes on the Dalton?
Well, the William Dalton for me, when I first had it, it was the neck pour. It was fantastic. It was like Wheaties and cornflakes got in a fight inside of a wheat bread bag. and it was really good. I enjoyed it.
Good. Yeah.
Now that's all I can smell, right?
Yeah.
Well, one thing I want to throw out here too. So you mentioned the neck pour thing too. One thing that a lot of people don't understand about pot still whiskey in general is it does benefit from being decanted quite a bit. It's not going to hurt anything to pour it and let it set for a little while, because pot still whiskey, it has some more funk to it, right? You're distilling as much water as you are ethanol, and that water is where your flavor's at. And because of that, you're pulling some aromatics you wouldn't normally get from a column still. And it doesn't hurt to give it a little air from time to time. Matter of fact, before we bottle, when we proof, we go into a blending tank and we hit it with air hard to blow off a lot of the volatility that we don't want initially. So
I've aired all my bottles out. I have them all open. Well, the ones I have multiple. Right. So when I open a new one, I pop the cork, I pour some, I let it all sit for half an hour, maybe even.
Yeah.
Then I cork the bottle back and then go to town.
We do. The other thing that we do that I think is probably unique, and you guys probably haven't heard this from another distiller, and it's a wine trick. And I always forget to mention it, but you guys might find it interesting. So with wine, whenever you go into the bottle, wine a lot of times can go through what's called bottle sickness, where it just doesn't taste quite right for a couple weeks. Pot stilled whiskey will do the same thing. So when we bottle, it goes into the cage and it sits there for 2 weeks before I even go in, grab a bottle, open it up, see if it tastes right, and it goes out. So it just needs a little time to kind of settle when it goes into the bottle and goes through all that turbulence. So,
well,
Good. Thank
Boone County hasn't figured that out.
Stop.
I have not tried any of their stuff in a couple of years, but now I'm going to have to go see what's
There, I got a
going
bottle
on there.
for you. You can have it.
Well,
the single barrel stuff is good. The off the shelf stuff is a little.
Yeah, no, Fantastics. They've got some
A
good
little
juice,
raw.
no question. But that pot still, woo.
let me offer this to you guys, because distillation is my thing. You know, I love it. And when I'm not distilling, I'm probably thinking about it, reenacting it, or doing home distilling videos for YouTube or podcasting about it, whatever. But I don't collect whiskey at all. If it's good, I drink it and it's gone. If it's bad, I give it away. But there's one thing I do collect, and you guys, all of you, could help me out with this, and the ladies could probably be mules as well. The one thing I collect is samples of really bad shit. So I have probably the world's largest collection of like faulty whiskey and brandy, and that's what I keep, right? Because I try to figure out what's wrong with it. What did they do wrong? How did they do it wrong, right? And how could you possibly improve that? So if you have anything, I don't need the whole bottle, just little samples, and label it. But feel free to send those my direction. So
Okay,
I'll do that.
I'm sure I could come up with some.
So I do have last question for the night, and then we can wrap it up. So since you're friends with like Bill, because I know that, so Bill obviously, for anybody who doesn't know, Bill works for oh my god, why did I just
Dayton Barrel Works.
Dayton Barrel Works. I was going to say Dayton Beer Company, which is the same company, but Dayton Barrel Works. And he picked that batch one for Rubicon Creek, which I thought was great. We got to sample the absinthe the last time we went there for a tour. Do you have any plans to do like a collaboration between you guys? I know that doesn't always happen in the whiskey world. Everybody is passively a little arrogant. I don't mean that in a bad way, but you know what I mean?
No,
like,
yeah.
you want your own thing. But is there any plans maybe to like you guys hook up and do a couple barrels that you think is the right mixture, or the right mash bill or whatever? I mean, have you thought about that before?
Yeah, so I would absolutely love to do a project like that with Bill. And if I was going to do it with anybody, Bill would definitely be one of the people on the top of my list for sure. But for those of you who, if there's anybody here, and I know there's not a lot of crossover, but if you do like absinthe, Bill and I have already done a collaboration in the past that people don't know about. So if any of you are familiar with Key West Trading Company down in Key West, Florida.
That's what we had.
Yep. Yeah. So that was the absinthe that was prototyped in my basement. And I didn't have the capacity to produce it at Spirits of French Lick. So I kicked Bill the contract on that. So it's my recipe, Bill's distillation, and then Jim at Key West doing the marketing and owning the brand. So, and it is a true absinthe. I mean, it's right up there with the Jade Liqueurs stuff. It's right in the Ban era. For sure, 1880s style, true Verde absinthe. So, yeah,
I'm not a big black licorice fan, but it was good. It was good.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, for anybody that's not a black licorice fan that doesn't like absinthe, I'll tell you something to try that might change your mind just a little bit. So absinthe and root beer have very similar flavor compounds. You make a highball with absinthe out of absinthe and A&W root beer in particular, it'll change a lot of people's minds real quick. So, and it'll get you plastered pretty damn quick too. So
I lived in Europe, so I've had I guess like the OG absinthe before, which is an experience in itself.
Yep.
I don't know if it's like subconsciously, like, you know, you're picturing Euro trip or whatever, but it was fun.
I tried to collect absinthe for a little while, but you know, I go back to what I said to you guys earlier about if I like something, I drink it, and I probably drank more absinthe at one point in time than any person ever should have.
So real quick before we wrap up, anybody else have any other questions or input? Thank yous? Anything? All right, Alan. Well, I will say personally, thank you. I'm glad we finally got to do this. I'm sorry it took so long.
It's all good.
I think when we first talked, the world was like ending. Right. Obviously, a year and a half later, it's not. But we look forward to seeing you here. Hopefully, you know, not hopefully, but seeing you here in October. So, yeah. Thanks for your time tonight, man. I appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for having me, guys. And I'm glad I was able to do this. And hopefully, I answered your questions and didn't come off too full of shit or cocky or any of those things. So
you did awesome, man. I look forward to talking to you again.
All right, guys.
Thanks, man.
Have a good one. Yep.
Bye.
Later,
Thank
guys.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.